Winter killed more World War II soldiers than bullets. Not metaphorically, literally. At Moscow, 250,000 German frostbite cases left 20,000 men without feet. In Europe, trench foot hospitalized the equivalent of 3 entire divisions. At Stalingrad, men froze solid at their posts. But here's the part they don't tell you. Survival didn't come from weapons or orders. It came from building. Soldiers learned to turn the very snow trying to kill them into walls, roofs, and insulation. They carved caves that stayed at 0 degrees when the outside dropped to -40. They raised sleeping platforms above entrances to trap heat, cut ventilation holes no bigger than an inch to keep from suffocating, and lined the floor with pine boughs to create air pockets. This wasn't luxury. This was life or death. In the deadliest winter of the 20th century, the shelter you built was as important as the rifle you carried. Moscow hit -40 Celsius. Stalingrad hit -30 while soldiers were already starving. The Battle of the Bulge happened during one of the coldest winters on record. American troops chopping foxholes into frozen ground next to haystacks, wrapped in whatever they could scavenge, waiting for German tanks. The casualty numbers from cold exceed what most people think is possible. Frostbite caused over 1 million casualties in 20th century wars total. 1 million from being cold. At Moscow alone, German losses from cold exceeded losses from combat. The Red Army was shooting at them, sure, but winter was winning. Temperature doesn't take prisoners. Temperature just calculates the differential between your core body heat and ambient air, then starts shutting down your extremities. Fingers first, toes, ears, nose. Your body sacrifices the outside to protect the inside. When that stops working, you die. The process is mechanical, predictable, unstoppable without intervention. Soldiers discovered their war had 2 enemies. One shot back, one just waited. Frozen ground defeated doctrine. Every army trained its soldiers to dig defensive positions. Every army assumed the ground would cooperate. Winter said no. Entrenching tools, the little folding shovels every soldier carried, bounced off earth that had transformed into something closer to concrete than soil. You couldn't penetrate it, couldn't chip it. The blade just rang off the surface and the vibration went up your arms. Hitler's directive to forces at Moscow captures the desperation. Dig trenches with howitzer shells if needed. Use explosives meant for killing the enemy to excavate holes in dirt. The temporal crisis killed men before they solved it. Standard foxhole construction takes hours even in cooperative soil. In frozen ground, you're looking at half a day of work minimum. Hypothermia kills in under 3 hours at extreme temperatures. The equation doesn't balance. Shell scrapes were the early attempt, shallow horizontal positions where you pressed yourself flat and hoped shells went over you. Tank treads at Kasserine Pass crushed soldiers inside these inadequate holes. The modern foxhole emerged after that lesson got paid for in blood. Vertical instead of horizontal, bottle-shaped, deep enough to stand in. Wide at the bottom so you could crouch when artillery came. A grenade sump at the floor, deeper narrow slit where you kicked live explosives to get them away from your body when they went off. The design improved. The frozen ground remained impenetrable. The time constraint remained fatal. Soldiers caught between enemy fire and physics needed to stop fighting the earth and start working with what winter provided. Finnish soldiers fighting the Soviet invasion in 1939 figured something out. Snow insulates. Sounds wrong. Snow is frozen water is cold, cold kills you. How does cold protect you from cold? Air. Air trapped between ice crystals prevents heat transfer. Same principle behind modern insulation, except you're building it from the blizzard trying to kill you. A properly constructed snow cave maintains 0 degrees Celsius inside when outside temps hit -40. That's a 40-degree differential. 0 isn't warm. 0 is survival temperature. 0 means you wake up in the morning. The engineering principle: heat rises, cold sinks. Position the entrance below the sleeping chamber, and warmth gets trapped in the upper space. Cold air, denser, heavier, falls to the floor by the door where nobody's sleeping. No mechanical system required. Gravity and temperature differential doing the work. Construction specs were precise because deviation killed you. Minimum snow depth, 4 to 5 feet. You needed material. Dome-shaped roof to shed accumulating snow weight and prevent collapse. Flat roofs caved in. Survivors learned this by having flat roofs cave in on them. Walls exactly 1 foot thick. Too thin and your body heat melts through overnight. Too thick and you waste energy digging that you need for staying warm. Build time. 3 to 4 hours for 2 to 3 people in good conditions. The paradox remained. You had to survive the exposure long enough to build what protected you from exposure. The construction process turned waste into walls. You dug into a snowdrift, cutting blocks from the snow you removed. 16 inches per side, as square as frozen hands could cut. Those blocks didn't get tossed aside. They became your front wall. The hole you made became the room you lived in. The stuff you excavated became the barrier protecting that room. Dig a path into the mound until your cut reaches about your own height. When you're close to where the entrance goes, switch from shovel to saw if you have one, and trenching tool if you don't. Cut blocks. Stack 8 to 10 aside, enough to build the wall later. Then keep excavating. Inside, carve a raised sleeping platform above the entrance. Cold air falls. Let it fall to the floor by the door. The platform needs to be wide enough for bodies side by side. Every person adds heat, and long enough to lie flat plus 18 inches for gear. Dome ceiling serves 2 functions. Structural. Curved surface distributes weight, prevents collapse under accumulating snow. Hydrological. Curved surface channels condensation down walls instead of dripping on sleeping soldiers. Drips freeze you. Wall runoff freezes into an ice layer that actually improves insulation. The detail that determines whether you suffocate. Ventilation hole at the highest point, 1 to 1.5 inches diameter. Too small and carbon dioxide from exhaled breath accumulates. Symptoms start as headaches and deeper breathing. By the time you recognize the problem, you're oxygen deprived and thinking poorly. Too large and heat escapes faster than bodies generated. 1 to 1.5 inches, and snow accumulates outside through the night, sealing the hole shut. Someone has to stay awake enough to clear it with a stick pushed up from inside. Miss it once and everyone stops breathing while they sleep. Soldiers engineered warmth from battlefield debris. Pine and spruce boughs layered on sleeping platforms created air pockets. Air doesn't conduct heat well. Trap it between organic material and you have insulation. The insulation was adequate, nothing more. Shelter halves were canvas rain ponchos. Standard issue, every soldier carried one. 2 soldiers snap their halves together. You get a tent 7 feet by 5 feet. No floor. Open both ends. Better than lying in snow, which was the comparison standard when death from exposure was the alternative. Finnish troops cut bed sheets into snow camouflage because their army issued nothing. White fabric worn over uniforms made them invisible against snow. Soviet forces wore olive drab until late January 1940. Tactical disadvantage from institutional failure meeting field improvisation. German soldiers at Stalingrad stripped underwear off Soviet corpses, wrapped rags around boots when leather failed. Soviet troops built stoves from rubble bricks, from ammunition boxes filled with dirt, from fuel barrels cut and shaped into heating devices. Everything served double purpose. Everything became something else. You didn't carry enough to survive, so you built survival from what you found. Multiple bodies in enclosed snow space generate serious heat, enough to raise interior temperature from -40 outside to 0 inside. 40-degree differential from nothing but metabolism. Your body as furnace, a 98.6-degree heat source running continuously. But moisture from breath and sweat accumulated on interior walls, forming ice crust that reduced airflow. Soldiers scraped walls nightly to maintain ventilation. The ice improved insulation, but decreased breathability. Another trade-off measured in survival margins. The buddy system was thermal engineering. Frostbite treatment required rewarming frozen tissue slowly using someone else's core body heat. Hands under a partner's clothing against torso, feet against abdomen. You used another person's body as a heating pad because that was the only heating pad. This required exposing your own core temperature, making yourself colder to make someone else warmer. Small unit cohesion became life support infrastructure. The soldier next to you was your survival technology. Behind lines, some units ran drying tents, pyramidal tent with stove. 7 men rotated in for 45 minutes to 2 hours. Dry clothes, warm up, return to frozen positions. Next group comes in. Maintenance dressed up as comfort. Wet clothing loses 90% insulation through evaporative cooling. Wet soldiers die faster. Drying tents were a logistical necessity. Finns rotated entire units from front to heated rear shelters for recovery. Finns understood. Soldiers lose combat effectiveness in continuous cold faster than they lose body heat. Warm soldier in rear position today becomes effective soldier at front tomorrow. Frozen soldier at front today becomes casualty tonight. Preparation determined casualty rates with mathematical precision. German forces planned for summer victory, brought no winter doctrine to the Eastern Front. Assumption that Moscow falls before first snow turned catastrophically wrong. 250,000 frostbite cases at Moscow. 20,000 amputations. Cold removed more soldiers than combat. Hitler's gambling created medical crisis without Soviets firing a shot. Americans at the Bulge faced historic cold without training or equipment. October 1944 to April 1945, 46,107 soldiers hospitalized for trench foot. 3 full divisions removed by wet feet. Trench foot happens when feet stay cold and wet just above freezing for extended periods. Blood vessels constrict, circulation drops, nerves die, skin breaks down, feet swell, turn colors, blister, gangrene, amputation. Trench foot works differently than frostbite. The endpoint is identical. Immobilized soldier, combat ineffective, dead without intervention. Finns used civilian skiing skills every man already had, rotated troops to rear shelters, knew the terrain because they lived there. Smaller force held off Soviet invasion by treating winter as engineering problem. Soviets learned from catastrophic winter war performance in 1939–40, when some units had 10% frostbite casualties before crossing Finnish border. By 1941, proper winter doctrine, factory-made stoves, insulated uniforms, cold weather training. The difference between survival and statistics, treating winter as enemy that could be outmaneuvered through preparation. Winter warfare turned soldiers into builders. Shelter became as critical as weapon. Desperate improvisation evolved into formalized techniques separating survivors from casualties. The refined principles survivors pass to new arrivals. Dome roofs don't collapse, flat ones do. Clear ventilation holes constantly. Set watch rotation. Layer clothing systematically. Wicking base layer, insulating middle, wind-blocking shell. Each serves specific thermal function. Start patrols cold to avoid sweating. Sweat saturates base layer. When you stop moving, evaporative cooling drops core temperature faster than external cold alone. Counterintuitive survival rule. Being cold at the start keeps you alive at the end. No CO2. Suffocation symptoms. Headaches, deeper breathing, confusion. Check on sleeping soldiers through night. Someone stays conscious enough to monitor. Understand buddy rewarming. Frostbitten extremities against core heat. Slow process to prevent tissue damage. Master the temporal equation. Build faster than cold kills. 3 to 4 hours for snow cave for 2 to 3 people. That window is fixed by physics. Only variable you control is speed and efficiency. Time spent building is time spent exposed, but rushing produces failures that kill overnight. Doctrine is codified, learning paid for in casualties. By war's end, Finnish improvisation from winter war had spread across armies and theaters. The shelter you built determined whether you lived. Simple as that. Soldiers who learned to turn winter into material survived. Soldiers who understood snow could be insulation instead of grave marker survived. The ground wouldn't let you dig down, so you built up. The air tried to kill you, so you used what the air froze to protect yourself. Snow caves on the Eastern Front, insulated foxholes in the Ardennes, dugouts reinforced with logs and scavenged materials across every winter theater. Men who had never built anything more complex than a campfire became engineers out of necessity. The alternative was freezing to death in a hole while waiting for orders. Temperature doesn't care about your training, doesn't care about your equipment, doesn't care about your tactical position or strategic objectives. Temperature measures core heat against ambient air and calculates time to incapacitation. Physics is enemy combatant, but physics can also be weaponized in reverse. Air trapped between ice crystals becomes insulation. Body heat in enclosed space becomes heating system. Snow blocks cut from excavation become walls. Every principle trying to kill you can be turned around and used for survival if you understand how it works. The soldiers who figured this out, who built domes instead of flat roofs, who cut ventilation holes exactly the right size, who layered boughs for insulation and rotated through drying tents and understood that staying slightly cold prevented deadly sweating. Those soldiers saw spring. The others are still there, frozen in positions they couldn't maintain, buried under snow that never became shelter, casualties of a war that history books don't count because the enemy was temperature and the battlefield was every breath of air that dropped below zero. Winter took 1 million casualties in the 20th century, 1 million soldiers removed from combat by cold. The ones who survived didn't beat winter. You don't beat thermodynamics. They just learned to build faster than it could kill them. 3 to 4 hours to construct a snow cave. Less time than that before hypothermia shuts you down. The window between death and survival measured in the same units. Math that doesn't lie. The soldiers who lived through winter warfare carried the knowledge home. how to read snow depth, how to cut blocks, how to position an entrance below a sleeping chamber, how to clear a ventilation hole in darkness. Technical skills learned under conditions where failure meant you didn't wake up. That knowledge cost 250,000 frostbite cases at Moscow to acquire. Cost 46,107 cases of trench foot in the Ardennes. Cost thousands of Soviet soldiers who froze in improvised shelters during the Winter War. The doctrine written in snow was written in casualties first, but it worked. Men turned blizzards into building material, turned the coldest winter of the century into architecture, survived temperatures that should have killed them by understanding that physics doesn't care about killing you. It just operates according to principles that can be used or ignored. The ones who used those principles built shelters. The ones who ignored them became statistics. Spring came eventually. The ground thawed, the snow melted, the shelters collapsed back into the drifts they came from, but the men who built them walked out alive. That's the whole story. Build or die, 3 to 4 hours, 1 to 1.5 inch ventilation hole, dome roof, raised platform. Survival measured in the precision of your engineering and the speed of your construction. The cold never negotiated, never surrendered, never retreated. The soldiers who survived learned to build anyway.